The Battle of Berlin was the last major battle in Europe during World War II. It was a climactic confrontation that saw the Soviet Union's Red Army launch a massive offensive against the heart of Nazi Germany. The battle was not just a military engagement but a symbol of the final collapse of the Third Reich. It took place from April 16th to May 2nd, 1945. Over these intense 2 weeks, the city of Berlin became a battlefield, with every street and building turning into a site of fierce combat. The dates mark a period of relentless fighting, where the fate of Europe was being decided. The Soviet army fought its way into the heart of Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany. The Red Army, under the command of Marshal Zhukov, advanced through the city with determination, facing fierce resistance from German forces. The streets of Berlin echoed with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and the cries of soldiers. The city was defended by the remnants of the German army. These defenders included not only regular soldiers but also members of the Hitler Youth and the Volkssturm, a militia composed of older men and young boys. Despite their desperate efforts, they were no match for the overwhelming Soviet forces. The battle was brutal and destructive. Buildings crumbled under the relentless bombardment, and the once vibrant cityscape was reduced to rubble. The destruction was a testament to the ferocity of the fighting and the determination of both sides to achieve victory at any cost. It resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. Thousands of soldiers and civilians lost their lives in the battle. The human cost was staggering, with the streets of Berlin littered with the bodies of the fallen. The suffering and loss experienced during these days were immense and left a lasting scar on the city. Berlin, once a proud capital, was left in ruins. The city's infrastructure was devastated, and its population was left to grapple with the aftermath of the conflict. The ruins of Berlin stood as a stark reminder of the war's devastation and the heavy price of conflict. The fall of Berlin marked the end of Nazi Germany. With the capture of the city, Adolf Hitler's regime crumbled, and the war in Europe drew to a close. The surrender of German forces in Berlin was a pivotal moment that signaled the end of an era of tyranny and oppression. It was a decisive moment in the history of the 20th century. The Battle of Berlin not only ended the war in Europe but also set the stage for the post-war world. The victory of the Allies paved the way for the reconstruction of Europe and the establishment of a new world order. The fall of Berlin remains a powerful symbol of the triumph of good over evil and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. Berlin was incredibly important symbolically. It was the heart of the Nazi regime. Capturing Berlin meant defeating Hitler and his ideology. The city was also a strategic target. It was a major industrial center and transportation hub. Controlling Berlin meant controlling Eastern Germany. The Soviets were determined to take Berlin. They wanted revenge for the German invasion of their country. They also wanted to assert their dominance in post-war Europe. On one side stood the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin. Stalin, a ruthless dictator, was determined to crush Germany and expand Soviet influence. His vision for the post-war world was one where the Soviet Union would emerge as a dominant global power, spreading its communist ideology far and wide. Stalin's leadership was marked by a combination of fear and respect, as he maintained an iron grip over his people and his military. The Red Army, commanded by the skilled General Georgy Zhukov, was a formidable force. Zhukov, known for his strategic brilliance and unyielding determination, had already proven his mettle in several key battles. Under his command, the Red Army had become a well-oiled war machine capable of executing complex maneuvers and overwhelming their enemies with sheer numbers and firepower. Millions of soldiers were pushing towards Berlin, fueled by years of suffering under German occupation. The memories of atrocities committed by the Nazis drove them forward with a fierce resolve. These soldiers, many of whom had lost family and friends to the brutalities of war, saw the fall of Berlin as a chance for retribution and justice. Their advance was relentless, marked by fierce battles and significant sacrifices. On the other side was Nazi Germany, a regime on the brink of collapse. The once mighty Third Reich was now crumbling under the weight of its own ambitions and the relentless pressure from the Allied forces. The cities lay in ruins, the infrastructure was shattered, and the morale of the German people was at an all-time low. Adolf Hitler, the Nazi dictator, remained in Berlin, clinging to power even as his armies crumbled. His refusal to surrender and his delusional belief in a miraculous turnaround kept him isolated in his bunker. Hitler's leadership had become increasingly erratic, and his decisions were driven more by desperation than by any coherent strategy. He commanded a desperate defense, relying on fanatical soldiers and poorly trained civilians. The German military, once a symbol of precision and strength, was now a shadow of its former self. The defense of Berlin was marked by chaos and confusion, with units often acting independently and without clear orders. Among them were the Hitler Youth, teenagers thrust into a hopeless battle. These young boys, some barely in their teens, were indoctrinated with Nazi ideology and sent to the front lines with minimal training. Their presence on the battlefield was a tragic testament to the desperation of the Nazi regime, as they faced seasoned Soviet soldiers with little more than blind loyalty and a will to fight. By April 1945, the Red Army was closing in on Berlin from the east. The Western Allies, led by the United States and Great Britain, were advancing from the west. Germany was caught in a vice. On April 16, 1945, the Soviets unleashed a massive artillery bombardment on German positions east of Berlin. The Battle of the Seelow Heights, the last major defensive line before Berlin, had begun. Section 5. The Seelow Heights, a desperate German defense. The Seelow Heights were a natural barrier overlooking a marshy valley. The Germans, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought fiercely. They knew that the fate of Berlin, and perhaps the entire Reich, rested on their shoulders. The Soviets suffered heavy casualties. However, their overwhelming numbers and firepower eventually prevailed. After 4 days of intense fighting, the Red Army broke through the German defenses. The road to Berlin lay open. Section 6. The Nightmare of Berlin Urban Warfare begins. On April 20, 1945, Hitler's birthday, Soviet artillery began shelling the outskirts of Berlin. Panic gripped the city as civilians and soldiers alike realized the battle had reached their doorstep. The fighting in Berlin was some of the most brutal of the entire war. The Soviets, eager for revenge, fought street by street, building by building. The Germans, many of them fanatical Nazis or terrified civilians, resisted fiercely. Section 7. Hitler's Last Stand, the Führerbunker. As the battle raged above, Adolf Hitler remained deep underground in his bunker, the Führerbunker. This complex of reinforced rooms beneath the Reich Chancellery was his last refuge. Surrounded by his closest advisors and his mistress Eva Braun, Hitler clung to the delusional belief that Germany could still achieve victory. He issued orders to non-existent armies and raged against his enemies. Section 8. The Fall of Berlin, May 1, 1945. On April 30th, as Soviet troops closed in on the bunker, Hitler committed suicide. He shot himself while his new wife, Eva Braun, swallowed cyanide. Their bodies were burned in the Chancellery Garden, a final act of defiance. With Hitler dead and the city in ruins, the remaining German forces surrendered on May 2, 1945. The Battle of Berlin was over. The war in Europe was effectively at an end. Section 9. The Aftermath. A city in ruins. The Battle of Berlin left the city devastated. Thousands of buildings were destroyed. Streets were littered with rubble and corpses. The Spree River was choked with debris. The civilian population, who had endured weeks of terror and deprivation, emerged from cellars and bomb shelters to find their city in ruins. Food and water were scarce. Disease was rampant. Section 10. The Significance of the Battle. The Battle of Berlin was a turning point in history. It was not just another battle, it was the culmination of years of conflict, strategy, and sacrifice. The battle represented the final major offensive of the European theater of World War II. It marked the end of the Nazi regime and the defeat of Germany in World War II. The fall of Berlin signified the collapse of Hitler's Third Reich, bringing an end to the brutal dictatorship that had caused immense suffering and destruction across Europe. The war in Europe was over. The streets of Allied nations were filled with celebrations as people rejoiced in the hard-won victory. The sense of relief and triumph was palpable, as the long and devastating conflict had finally come to an end. The battle also had profound consequences for the post-war world. The geopolitical landscape of Europe was forever altered. Borders were redrawn, and nations had to rebuild from the ruins of war. The aftermath of the battle set the stage for a new world order. It solidified the Soviet Union's position as a dominant power in Eastern Europe. The Red Army's capture of Berlin demonstrated Soviet military might and established their influence over the region, leading to the creation of the Eastern Bloc. It set the stage for the Cold War, a period of intense rivalry and tension between the Soviet Union and the United States. This ideological struggle was characterized by a race for nuclear arms, space exploration, and a series of proxy wars around the globe. The ideological struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States would shape the latter half of the 20th century. The world was divided into two camps, each promoting its own vision of governance and society. This division influenced international relations, economic policies, and even cultural exchanges for decades to come. The significance of the Battle of Berlin extends beyond the immediate military victory. It was a catalyst for change, prompting efforts to rebuild and reshape Europe. The Marshall Plan, for instance, was introduced to aid in the economic recovery of war-torn European nations. Additionally, the battle underscored the need for international cooperation, leading to the formation of the United Nations. This new global organization aimed to prevent future conflicts and promote peace and security worldwide. The legacy of the Battle of Berlin is a testament to the resilience and determination of those who fought and lived through it. It serves as a reminder of the costs of war and the enduring quest for peace and stability in the world. Section 11. Conclusion, a turning point in history. The Battle of Berlin was a brutal and costly victory for the Soviet Union. It was a final, desperate struggle that left a city in ruins and a continent scarred. The battle marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in human history. It also served as a stark reminder of the horrors of war and the enduring human cost of conflict.